Hey guys, Naj Kazi here. Welcome to another awesome video. In today's video, I'm gonna touch base on SD-WAN competitive landscape. We're gonna do a Gartner Magic Quadrant review of the top 3 players in the SD-WAN space, and I'm gonna give you a no BS review. So it's gonna be a very exciting one. I'm pumped. Without further ado, let's roll. Let's jump right into it. Here are the topics I plan on covering today. First, Gartner Magic Quadrant. Second, Cisco Viptela SD-WAN. Third, Silver Peak. 4, VMware VeloCloud. And finally, I'm going to give you a bunch of pro tips. With that, let me take you on a quick journey. So here I am, curiously wondering what's happening on those islands. Let's check them out. We got 4 different islands here. We got the Gartner Magic Quadrant Island, Cisco Island, Silver Peak Island, and VMware VeloCloud Island. Let's get started with the Gartner Magic Quadrant Island. Here we're going to do a quick analysis of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. In particular, we're going to look at the quadrant for WAN edge infrastructure. This is the SD-WAN quadrant. Gartner decided in their infinite wisdom to call it WAN edge infrastructure. I'm being a bit cynical here, but I think it's very appropriately named. So Gartner Magic Quadrant, without getting into too much detail, is divided into 4 different boxes called quadrants. So we start off with the leaders quadrant, which is the top right. Visionaries is the bottom right. Niche players is the bottom left. Challengers, top left. Now, instead of spending time in other quadrants, we're just going to focus on leaders quadrant. Another item I want to draw your attention to is the X and Y axis. The Y axis shows the ability to execute by each of these players. And at the bottom, we're seeing the completeness of vision. So leaders are the ones that not only have a great vision, but they have an amazing ability to execute. That being said, let's zoom into the leaders quadrant. This year's Gartner Magic Quadrant is very unique in a sense that we have a lot of leaders that have emerged in 2020. Last year, in 2019, there were only 2 players that were considered leaders: VMware VeloCloud and Silver Peak. Even Cisco had been pushed into the Challengers quadrant in 2019, but in 2018, Cisco was also in the leaders quadrant. And the reason for Cisco's shift had to do with the Viptela acquisition and then Cisco trying to shoehorn the iOS XE into the Viptela code. So I think that kind of caused a little bit of that shuffle. But that being said, let's focus in on 3 players that I want to talk about today. We'll talk about VMware VeloCloud, we'll talk about Cisco Viptela, and we'll talk about Silver Peak. I'm not going to talk about the other guys in the leaders quadrant. They have their own specialties, but another element that I want to bring to your attention before we move on from here is there's a lot of interesting power play going on. So Palo Alto Networks acquired CloudGenix, who specialized in SD-WAN, and Silver Peak was also recently acquired by HPE, HP's sister company. So it's really interesting what's going on in the SD-WAN realm. It's exciting times. With that, let's go ahead and take a look at the Cisco solution real quick. So we're going to go ahead and visit the Cisco Island. So guys, in full disclosure, I'm not going to spend too much time on Cisco today because my previous video is an in-depth analysis of Cisco SD-WAN. So if you're really interested in doing a deep dive in Cisco, check out my previous video. I'm going to provide a card in this video so you can just tap on it. And I will also provide a link down in the video description, and I'm going to also provide a bunch of other references in the description below, so definitely check that out. So let's jump right into the Cisco solution. So here's the high-level view of the Cisco SD-WAN architecture. The first element I want to draw your attention to is the separation of the data plane, control plane, and the management plane. Data plane is the transport, the routers, the circuits, and all that. And that's what we're looking at here in the red box. Cisco calls them either C-Edge or V-Edge, depending on the type of appliance you have. And you could either have a physical appliance or a virtual appliance. If you happen to have cloud-based connectivity, you're going to spin up, a VM there. It's all ZTP or zero-touch provisioning based. This is the data plane component of it. And you could have any type of transport, MPLS, internet, 4G, LTE, whatever have you. Remember, the whole idea of SD-WAN is transport is irrelevant. It's all about the overlay, not the underlay. And by the way, the data plane component is also the underlay of the network. Now let's shift our attention to the control plane. This is where the value proposition of SD-WAN shines. So here we separate the control plane from the routers, and we have now moved that intelligence into the controllers, in particular vSmart controllers. They're the brains of the entire solution. And they're the ones that are responsible for pushing the routing and security configuration down to the routers at the bottom of the screen. You're talking horizontal scale, which means if you need to add more SD-WAN appliances, you can just keep adding more and more vSmart controllers. Finally, the management plane component, and this is the key, because vManage is where everything happens. This is the portal that you as a customer log into once you purchase a solution, and from here, you get to configure all the controllers. And not only you get to configure, but you can monitor, you can troubleshoot. You have a view of the entire SD-WAN fabric right here in the vManage controller. You also have third-party APIs that you can leverage, different type of automation solutions. As I mentioned earlier, for more details, watch my previous video. For the sake of expediency, I'm going to move to the next section. Now let's quickly take a look at the appliance portfolio. So what Cisco has is the traditional ISR, ASR portfolio. Depending on your site, you may be a good fit for an ISR 1K or ISR 4K or maybe an ASR 1K. It just depends if it's a branch site, if it's a data center, or something in between. And if you happen to have cloud-based access into AWS, Azure, or GCP, you're going to have to spin up a CSR 1K. Moving on to the next item. When Cisco acquired Viptela for north of $600 million, this is the portfolio that Cisco acquired, the vEdge platform from Viptela. They never got rid of it. These appliances are still available, and the reason they're available is because they're very cost effective. Now, the big thing about these boxes, the vEdge boxes, is that they do not support security. And if you're using the vEdge boxes, then of course, if you have the infrastructure as a service component like AWS, Azure, or GCP, you'll spin up the vEdge cloud. Finally, the virtualization component, these two boxes, ENCS 5000 and CSP 5000, you can run different virtual network functions. Watch my previous video to learn more. And now let's shift our attention to Silver Peak. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on Silver Peak and VeloCloud because I haven't created a separate video on either of these vendors, so I want to make sure that you guys have a good understanding. The Silver Peak SD-WAN platform is called Unity. And there are three components to the entire solution. The first piece is the Unity Orchestrator. This is the brains of the entire solution. This is the centralized controller. You configure, monitor, and everything in between right here on the orchestrator. It could be on-prem, It could be in the cloud, or you can have it as a orchestrator as a service where Silver Peak hosts the orchestrator in their cloud and you get access to it. And that's typically the most recommended way of doing SD-WAN, is to go with the cloud-based orchestrator because it's a lot more simpler. However, another component to keep in mind is that when you do get the cloud-based orchestrator, there's typically additional cost associated with it. Not every single vendor will charge you, but most of them will do for hosting the orchestrator in their cloud, because naturally they have to spend resources on your behalf to let that orchestrator be available. And they typically do a pretty good job. They have high availability set up as well, so you don't have to worry about it. But I just wanted to share that tip with you. Second element of the solution is the Unity Edge Connect. These are the boxes that you'll have in a physical form factor or in a virtual form in the cloud. And these are the SD-WAN appliances. These are the data plane devices. And finally, the third element of the solution is an optional component, and that is the Boost license. And Boost is the WAN optimization component. One thing to keep in mind, guys, is Silver Peak were WAN op or WAN optimization specialists before they got involved with SD-WAN. So they have really amazing WAN optimization capability. And they actually brought all that secret sauce from their WAN optimization realm and merged it into the SD-WAN code. And I think that really gives Silver Peak an edge in the industry when it comes to their SD-WAN offering. But once again, this is an optional component. You don't have to get it. This is something you could get. The big benefit being you don't have to buy another WAN optimization box. If you happen to be big into WAN op, with Silver Peak SD-WAN, you can get rid of the hardware and combine that functionality or consolidate it into the same hardware. So it's more like a one box type solution, which kind of makes it, once again, attractive from a financial standpoint. Now let's shift our attention to the Silver Peak Unity Edge Connect hardware portfolio. So as you can see here on the screen, what you have is t-shirt size style model numbers. So Edge Connect ultra small, extra small, small, all the way up to extra large. And as you can see, third row down, typical WAN bandwidth. This is where you look at the model name of the box and then match it with the WAN bandwidth. Remember, guys, with SD-WAN, we look at the circuits that we have and how much capacity we're going to need on that box. And the WAN bandwidth shown here is the total bandwidth. Whether you have a single circuit or you have multiple circuits, the key to pay attention to is altogether, that's the maximum WAN throughput you're going to get on that box. And you also want to look at the type of features you want to subscribe to and make sure you pick the right box. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Now let's visit the VMware VeloCloud island. VeloCloud solution is divided into three components. First, let's look at the green box. We have the VMware SD-WAN Edge. It's a virtual edge. There's a lot of flexibility in deployment. It's a purpose-built hardware offered by VeloCloud. They also work closely with Dell for fulfillment purposes. On top of having a physical hardware, you can also have a virtual edge in the cloud, which is pretty much the same as any other SD-WAN vendor. But what is unique about VeloCloud is the fact that you have the ability to run a VNF or a virtual network function, specifically a third-party VNF, right on your SD-WAN appliance. For example, Palo Alto Network Firewall. You have the ability to run a virtual instance of a PAN firewall right on your VeloCloud SD-WAN appliance, once again making it very attractive. One box solution approach. Very interesting and unique from that perspective. And You can have a branch, data center, cloud, whatever have you. The box below it in aqua, here we look at the orchestrator and the controllers. This is the portal that you log into. This is the brains of the entire solution. This is where everything happens. This is where you configure your business policies. This is where the APIs are if you want to do third-party automation. This is where the zero-touch provisioning is done. And this is where you configure all the templates and everything. You also monitor the environment here. You can have it running on VMware if it's in a virtual form, or your service provider might have it hosted, or you could have the controller on-prem. But one thing to keep in mind is you have to get special approval if you want to run it on-prem, depending on the deal size. This is not something VeloCloud offers by default to all the customers. So to me, it's a bit of a negative. But it's not a huge negative because about 95% of the customers are completely fine with a cloud-hosted orchestrator and a controller model. They don't really need to deploy the controllers on-prem. But if you happen to be on the on-prem side of the house, this is something to keep in mind. And as I mentioned, you configure your policies there, your APIs, and your zero-touch provisioning. Now let's move on to the final box here, VMware SD-WAN gateways. Now this is also something unique to VeloCloud. And what's happening here is we have optimized cloud on-ramp. So if you guys are familiar with the previous video I did called Cisco Cloud On-Ramp, it's the same idea here, but the big difference is VMware has already set up multiple gateways, hundreds of gateways across the globe. And in those gateways, they have their appliances sitting and they're constantly monitoring the quality of connectivity into the different SaaS and IaaS providers. And they're constantly detecting which path is better and which location is better from a geography perspective. And they redirect the traffic based on how the traffic is performing and how these servers are responding in real time. So it's a unique value proposition from VMware. It's fully managed by VMware. You don't have to worry about it. All you have to do is just make sure you have the appropriate licensing tier so you have this function available. It's multi-tenant. And as I mentioned, these gateways are strategically placed in different top-tier network points of presence, or POPs, around the globe. And the VMware SD-WAN Edge portfolio, it's divided into small, medium, and large. The smallest box being Edge 510 to the largest box being Edge 3800. For example, if you have a location that needs a 500 meg connectivity, you'll pick Edge 610 box. If you happen to have a site that requires 2 gig connectivity, you're going to need an Edge 840 box. If that site also requires a third-party VNF being ran on the same box, you could run a virtual instance of a PAN firewall right on your Edge 840 box. And finally, if you have a site that has a requirement of 10 plus gig connectivity, you're going to pick the Edge 3800 box. Now, that being said, a lot is happening in the SD-WAN space at a very fast pace, guys. So don't kill the messenger. By the time you're watching this video and you're talking to VMware and some of these boxes are end of life or are no longer available, because like I said, a lot is happening. New silicon, new chipset. So new pieces of hardware are constantly being rolled out. So take some of the hardware information that I'm sharing with you with a grain of salt. And just make sure you refer to your vendor documentation for up-to-date information. And now let me talk about the most exciting stuff, the pro tips. Let me take a moment to emphasize, this right here is a money shot. This is the money slide, okay? If you could take just one key takeaway from this entire conversation today, it's right here. This is not something you're going to find in books. This is not something you're going to be able to find in documentation. This is based on real-world experience that I've acquired over the years as a solution architect, talking to different vendors and customers and reading different documentation. So this right here could easily save you days worth of research. Let's jump right in. Let's look at row by row. So VMware and Silver Peak only have a single controller, whereas Cisco has 3 separate controllers. Now, I believe Cisco did themselves a little bit of a disservice by creating 3 separate controllers because it confuses a lot of the customers. But the reality of the matter is, guys, you don't have to touch any of those additional controllers. You only mess with the vManage. Everything else is behind the scenes. You never touch them. They're automatically configured through vManage. Second element, packet loss compensation. And that's a big one. Technologies like forward error correction and packet order correction and packet duplication. And here, Silver Peak shines. Based on some of the research I've done and some of the customers that I've talked to, Silver Peak is able to handle up to 10% packet loss compensation. So you could be on a broadband circuit, experience up to 10% packet loss, and your voice and video will still be okay. That is massive. Cisco recently introduced their forward error correction and packet duplication. It's there. Not sure how great that is because it's a recent feature. Time will tell. But Cisco just recently rolled it out. And with VMware, you can expect around 2% packet loss compensation. The next element, per packet load sharing versus flow-based load sharing. Even though the Cisco documentation says it's less intrusive to do flow-based load sharing because you're not doing asymmetrical routing and all that. However, I do know that Silver Peak, for example, can also do flow-based load sharing as well. So keeping that in mind, I think they're all on par, and their own proprietary technology that they use is pretty good at doing the load sharing piece of it. Now, another element to keep in mind is the VRF segmentation. So with VMware, only up to 16 VRFs are supported. Silver Peak uses VXLAN-based segmentation. They call them BIOs or business intent overlays. Maximum, I believe they only support 7. That number might change tomorrow, but as of this video, only 7 business intent overlays are supported. Cisco, however, offer unlimited segmentation. They call it unlimited, but there are physical limitations on the box as far as how many VRFs you can create. I think it taps out between 200 to 300. That's a lot. I have yet to see a clear real-world use case for having that many VRFs. Next up, this is for the geeks out there. VMware uses VCMP or VeloCloud management protocol. Silver Peak uses subnet sharing, and Cisco uses OMP or overlay management protocol. From a handoff perspective, both VMware and VeloCloud can only do Ethernet handoff, copper or fiber-based, whereas Cisco is unique in a sense that they can offer Ethernet or TDM, with TDM being T1, T3, or DS1, DS3, those type of circuits. Now, most of the customers today could care less about TDM. Everybody is pretty much on Ethernet, but just wanted to throw it out there in case if you had some TDM circuits in your environment. Next up is security. Both VMware and Silver Peak, for the most part, tell the customers that you should look into a secure internet gateway or a cloud access security broker, somebody like a Zscaler, or could be any other cloud-based security vendor, but that's what they recommend. However, as I mentioned earlier, with VeloCloud, you have the ability to host third-party VNF locally if you wanted to do that. And Cisco is unique in a sense that they have their own full-blown security. So you can do layer 7 app firewall. You can do IPS and IDS. You can do URL filtering. You can do advanced malware protection. And you can do umbrella DNS security, all configured on the Viptela box. So once again, Cisco is in a unique position there. Cisco also supports cloud-based security. Next up is the WAN optimization. Silver Peak shines there. VeloCloud doesn't do any optimization, whereas Viptela has the WAN op on the roadmap. As far as I know, Silver Peak is a clear winner. Next up, unified communication features or voice features. So if you have CUCM Express running on your routers, Cisco started supporting this feature a couple of months ago, and it's there. So Cisco is clearly a leader in that regard. And finally, if you're a full Cisco shop, if you have invested a ton of money with Cisco, and if you happen to have a ton of Cisco switches, and you also have Cisco SD-WAN, Cisco has started integrating SD-WAN and software-defined access, or SDA, via SGTs or security group tags or scalable group tags, so you can actually have a unified policy across the board. So it's kind of a unique element from that perspective, and Cisco has already started pushing these features out as I speak. So once again, Cisco is clearly a leader in that regard. That being said, let's talk about key differentiators. VMware VeloCloud, because of their third-party VNF, I believe that's their unique differentiator. Silver Peak, their 10% packet loss, plus their WAN op capability, absolutely key differentiators there. For Cisco Viptela, they have multiple handoff options. So if you have a very diversified handoff requirement for your circuits, Cisco is a clear winner. And also, if you want to do local firewall, local IDS, IPS on your SD-WAN appliances, Cisco is a clear winner in that area. Now let's move on to the key SD-WAN questions that you need to be concerned with in order to design a best practice SD-WAN solution. So what you need to be looking at is, when is your WAN contract up? You need to look at, when is your hardware contract coming up for renewal? How many sites do you have on MPLS? Can you take advantage of being on? Can you maybe ditch a couple of MPLS circuits and use internet instead? How many sites do you have altogether? This is important because that will help you understand the scale, so you can pick the right vendor that is capable of handling that many sites. Circuits, you need to see the type and the size of those circuits, whether or not those circuits are active today. If not, SD-WAN can help you there. Any performance issues that you have today, whether or not your WAN routers are currently being managed by a third party, or if you're managing them, whether or not you need to isolate different business units. If you do, how many do you have? Do you have a distributed firewall model where you have a firewall at each site, or do you backhaul all the traffic to your data center because of a centralized security model? Who's your firewall vendor? This question is important because that will help you understand whether or not the SD-WAN vendor you're about to pick, if they play nice with your firewall vendor. If you happen to be a 100% Cisco shop, how recent are your ISR and ASR routers? If they're fairly recent, you probably don't need to buy new ISRs and ASRs. You can just probably do a software upgrade on them to enable SD-WAN functionality through iOS XE. If you happen to be a Meraki shop, if you have a lot of Meraki APs and switches, maybe Meraki SD-WAN is a good solution. I know we didn't talk about Meraki SD-WAN today, but it's also a pretty decent solution if you don't need a lot of bells and whistles. It gets the job done. Maybe Meraki is the way to go. If you already have their access points and switches, maybe do a full stack Meraki. Something to think about. Next up, what are your business critical applications? And finally, what's your cloud strategy? It's important to understand your cloud strategy because that will help you determine whether or not you need the cloud on-ramp type feature provided by the different SD-WAN vendors. And finally, SD-WAN gotchas, the pitfalls. Things you want to avoid, otherwise they will get you big time. First up, advanced routing. If you have a very complex network that requires very advanced level BGP and OSPF and all that, you may want to look at vendors that are really, really good with advanced routing. So among the three that we talked about today, Cisco is a clear leader in advanced routing. Neither VeloCloud nor Silver Peak have any advanced routing capabilities. They have bare bone routing capabilities. Their whole idea is once you switch to SD-WAN, you could care less about routing. But the reality is, until you get to SD-WAN, you're going to live with a brownfield environment, with a hybrid environment where you're going to have some sites on SD-WAN, others on traditional WAN, you better make sure that you don't have any advanced routing needs. If you do, you better pick the right vendor. Second one up, SD-WAN appliance total throughput. So if you're going to start enabling advanced features, like on Cisco, for example, if you're going to do advanced firewall and IPS, IDS, and AMP and all that stuff, you better make sure in advance that you understand the total throughput requirements, because the box you initially thought you needed, you may have to go to the next level up or maybe 2 levels up to pick the right box for your sites, because now you're turning on all these different bells and whistles. From a VPN segmentation perspective, the key question here is, do you need multiple overlays within the same SD-WAN fabric, or do you need multi-tenancy and have separate SD-WAN fabrics? And what I mean by that is, to answer the first question, if you need multiple overlays within the same SD-WAN fabric, that's an easy thing to solve. You just need to make sure you have the ability to create multiple VRFs or multiple segments or VPNs. Whereas if you need multi-tenancy, then you better make sure that your SD-WAN vendor has robust multi-tenancy capabilities. And when I say multi-tenancy, that means each tenant has its own set of controllers and its own SD-WAN fabric, completely segmented from each other, completely separate. Number 4, security. For the most part, if you have existing firewalls, by all means use them. If they're not end of life, if they're not end of support, and you have already invested money in them, don't get rid of them, because the reality of the matter is, a lot of the vendors have started offering security features on the same box, but the security isn't really that reliable yet. And the boxes start to take a lot of big hit when you enable security. So I would closely watch this space for the next year or 2. Until then, keep your firewalls, don't get rid of them. Multicast. If you have multicast, most of the SD-WAN vendors do not support advanced, full-blown multicast. So you may want to retain your CE routers if you have very robust multicast in your environment today. Otherwise, what you would want to do is, some of the SD-WAN vendors do have very strong multicast capabilities. Make sure you pick the right one and sit down with their engineering team and the sales engineer and the solutions architect and figure out and design the environment appropriately. And the final tip I have for you guys is licensing. And this is a very important one, guys. Most vendors have 3 different licensing tiers. Make sure you understand them intimately. Create your feature wish list. Tell your SD-WAN vendor what features you're interested in. If you don't need all the bells and whistles, you don't. And don't let your vendor dictate that you do. Okay, so make sure you sit down, spend some time during the planning phase and figure out what are the key features you need. Make sure you understand licensing really, really well before ordering gear. If you order hardware before doing the licensing homework, guys, this misstep could cost you significantly. This could be a huge financial hit, because once you order everything and you start deploying, and then in the middle you find out that you needed more features, and now the boxes that you have are not capable of running those features, because the minute you start enabling those features, your box is going to take a throughput hit, and now you have to upgrade. If you have 10,000 sites, that's a big hit. I mean, you don't want to go bankrupt. So make sure that you do your engineering homework ahead of time, and you're good to go. And that wraps up today's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, give me a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.